So something kind of weird happened to me the other day. I was getting ready to write the script for this review, so I did what I usually do. I dug out my copy of Resident Evil 6 and fired it up for a quick playthrough. I can't say I was particularly looking forward to it, to be honest. Resident Evil 6 is, after all, the weak link in the series, right? The game that divided the fan base worse than The Last Jedi. Maybe an hour or so would be enough to refresh my memory and give me enough insight to write a decent summary. But then something happened. Time passed and I kept playing. I happened to glance at my watch and I realised I'd been playing this game for the better part of 3 hours. And weirdly, I wanted to keep going. Not to reach the ending cinematic in the shortest time possible, but because I wanted to get to the next set piece, watch the next cutscene, defeat the next boss. If I didn't know better, I'd say I was enjoying myself. Perhaps a rethink of Resident Evil 6 was in order. Back when I started this retrospective series, I mentioned that there's a great many things I enjoy about the Resident Evil games, but one aspect that continues to impress me is the sense of continuity that it's fought to maintain over the years. Other games are happy to gloss over the events of previous installments and in some cases outright contradict themselves, but Resident Evil has always managed to maintain a consistent, if complex, overarching narrative, and I think it deserves a lot of credit for that. But I think it would be fair to say that after nearly 20 years, dozens of heroes and villains, and multiple releases and spin-offs over countless different platforms, this narrative had become more of a liability than an asset. Put simply, Resident Evil was starting to tie itself in knots as it tried to work around its own convoluted storylines. What Capcom really needed was a blowout, a game which would tie together the various story strands and provide some kind of resolution that would allow the series to move forward in a more streamlined fashion. Think of it as Resident Evil's answer to the Avengers. That game was Resident Evil 6. The plan was an ambitious one. Rather than feature one single-player campaign, Resident Evil 6's plot would unfold via 4 interwoven storylines, each featuring a main character from previous games, assisted by a secondary character controlled by either the computer or another player, allowing co-op play just like in Resident Evil 5. Each campaign would incorporate different character abilities and gaming styles, with some being based around stealth and espionage, while others focused on action or more traditional survival horror. Enemies would be a mixture of classic zombies and the more intelligent and aggressive ganados, with a host of other mutated creatures thrown in to spice things up. In this way, the game would help bridge the gap between the old and the new, providing an experience that would truly satisfy everyone. That was the plan, at least. As for what actually happened, well... Reviews for the game could best be described as mixed. Resident Evil 6 divided fans and critics alike, and remains controversial even to this day. Some people love it, others hate it, but few are indifferent to it. So how did it all happen? Why is it so divisive? And does it really deserve the criticism it's taken over the years? Well, there's a lot to talk about here, so let's get into it. Development on RE6 began in 2009, shortly after the release of Resident Evil 5. A new production staff were brought in to oversee the game's development, with Yoshiaki Hirabashi overseeing production and Ichiro Sasaki acting as director. Sasaki was best known for directing the Resident Evil Outbreak series, which are generally seen as competent but underrated installments, and he was now ready to move up to the big leagues. Right from the start, the intention this time around was to go big, making RE6 more action-packed, more intense, and considerably longer than any previous game in the series. As Hirabayashi himself stated in an interview, their plan was to create the ultimate horror entertainment. But Hirabayashi was well aware of what was at stake if he didn't deliver what his audience wanted. He was eager to understand the strengths and failures of previous games, and paid particular attention to fan feedback for Resident Evil 5, which had been successful from a commercial point of view but had failed to reach the critical heights of its predecessor. Although the game was generally regarded as a solid action-adventure, the feeling was that it ventured too far from the series' survival horror roots, leaving some fans feeling unsatisfied. Hirabayashi wanted to strike a balance between these two perspectives, leading to the idea of multiple campaigns which would each focus on a different location, tone and gaming style. What he wanted was an epic, world-changing story told from different perspectives that would bring together all the main characters of the series. Series regulars Chris Redfield, Leon Kennedy and Ada Wong would all feature as playable characters, with a 4th character named Jake Muller adding as a new addition. The decision was also made to bring back zombies as a primary enemy for Leon's campaign, heightening the connection to earlier titles. Capcom were determined to throw everything they had at this game, and the development staff eventually ballooned to over 600 people. A playable demo of the game was released in early September, garnering immediate criticism from fans for its heavy reliance on action. Stung by this negative press, Capcom unveiled a different version at the San Diego Comic-Con later that month, hoping to reassure fans that the game would live up to their expectations. Well, it turns out they wouldn't have to wait long, as RE6 was officially released on Xbox 360 and PS3 in October that year. So what's it actually like? Well, much as I'm reluctant to boil a complex opinion down to a single word, if I had to sum up Resident Evil 6 in such a way, my word would be big. Everything about this game is bigger than what came before. The set pieces, the weapons, the maps, the campaigns and the scope are quite simply epic. It really is the endpoint as far as this series goes, the concept of action and survival taken to its logical, overblown conclusion. As I mentioned before, the overall game is split into 4 separate campaigns, each headed by a different protagonist. Chris Redfield, Leon Kennedy and Jake Muller's stories form the baseline game, with Ada Wong's campaign serving to fill in the blanks and tie together all 3 narratives. Firstly, there's Jake Muller, a mercenary with a mysterious past fighting in the Eastern European country of Edonia, who also possesses an immunity to the C virus that's starting to kill everyone. Sherry Birkin, remember her?
That was pretty impressive back there, Sherry.
It was nothing. I saw someone do that on TV once.
Yeah, well, she's all grown up now, and she's become a government agent. She soon hooks up with him and tries to recruit his help, but Jake's a no-nonsense outsider who plays by his own rules and doesn't want anything to do with the government. Enter Chris Redfield, still working for the BSAA after the events of Resident Evil 5. He and his strike team are deployed to contain the infection in Edonia, only to get ambushed and virtually wiped out by a woman claiming to be Ada Wong. Disillusioned and overwhelmed with guilt, Chris resigns and goes into exile. Jake and Sherry try to escape the country, only to be intercepted and captured by Ada. The narrative then shifts forward 6 months to pick up with Leon Kennedy, now acting as a bodyguard to the US President, who's decided to publicly reveal the truth of the Raccoon City incident back in 1998. Before he can make his big speech, however, the venue's attacked and most of the people there are turned into zombies, forcing Leon to fight his way out and uncover the identity of the attacker. He's accompanied by fellow agent Helena Harper, who knows more about the outbreak than she's letting on. All 3 storylines eventually converge in China, where a major viral outbreak is triggered and the various factions come into conflict with one another. Chris wants revenge on Ada because he believes her responsible for the deaths of his squad, Leon's determined to protect her until she can give her side of the story, and Jake is the classic loose cannon, aligned with no one and willing to do whatever it takes to stay alive. Eventually, each of these groups are forced to put aside their differences and work together to survive and defeat their true enemies. To be honest, the storyline for Resident Evil 6 is actually pretty good. It's big, suitably complex and filled with enough twists and revelations to sustain such a massive game. All 3 campaigns have their own self-contained arcs and antagonists, but naturally you have to play through the entire game to get the full picture. They also converge and intersect at various points, sometimes in unexpected ways, and usually you'll have to play through another character's campaign to understand the events that led to these situations. It's a neat little narrative device that keeps your interest and helps to sustain the pace as you work to discover the bigger picture behind a series of seemingly unconnected events. Ada Wong's storyline, typical of her mysterious persona, helps to shed light on events behind the scenes and tie up some loose ends from the main narrative. Chris is probably the weakest of the 4 scenarios. Plot-wise, it's a straight-up revenge narrative with a gameplay style that's heavily focused on action and gunplay. Chris lost his team to Ada Wong and he's determined to make her pay. This darker and brooding aspect of Chris's personality is interesting enough on the surface, and I like the idea of his experiences making him more jaded and cynical over time. The problem is that this was already hinted at in Resident Evil 5 when he was haunted by the loss of his partner Jill, so it does feel like a bit of a retread of old ground here. His campaign is basically a standard cover-based third-person shooter, with occasional squad-based action against larger enemies thrown in to spice things up. Basically, Chris is a big dumb bruiser who shoots first and asks questions later. There's plenty of firefights and explosions, you're rarely short of weapons or ammunition, and it'll all feel pretty familiar to anyone who played RE5. As a side note, the game features a few welcome improvements to the gameplay mechanics, notably your ability to move and shoot at the same time. Remember in RE5 how you'd want to retreat from the fight while you reloaded, or back away from approaching enemies while laying down cover fire, but you couldn't really do it because the game engine didn't have the correct animation? Well, now you can. It doesn't sound like a major change, but when you're trying to deal with large numbers of enemies in a confined space, it's an absolute godsend to be able to run and gun. Leon's is what I would consider the most balanced storyline of RE6, and about the closest the game gets to survival horror, as well as being the only one to feature actual zombies. Resources are scarce, so you need to be more judicious with your firepower. The pace is a little slower in places, which improves the atmosphere, gives the game some room to breathe, and encourages exploration. I'm not going to pretend it's anything like the earlier Resident Evil games, but it does at least draw inspiration from them in terms of its tone and pacing. It's just a shame the developers didn't fully commit to it, making something that was truly distinct instead of just a watered down version of Chris's campaign. Newcomer Jake Muller's campaign often finds you short on weaponry, forcing you to focus more on melee and close combat. Jake can use combos and abilities that the others don't have, allowing you to get in close and take the fight to your enemies. Unlike Chris and Leon, who are both driven to protect others and prevent the coming disaster, Jake is an aloof loner who basically just wants to be left alone. His unique heritage, however, means that he carries a natural immunity to the deadly C virus, so basically everyone's trying to get their hands on him. He's accompanied, reluctantly, by Sherry Birkin, who wants to use his abilities as a force for good. And gradually he comes to realise there's more to life than just himself, and maybe he can be a better man than his father. Hint hint. It's a pretty standard redemption story, but it works because it gives him a genuine arc. Lastly, Ada Wong's campaign acts as a kind of behind-the-scenes glimpse into major events throughout the main story, giving a different perspective on things that initially seemed black and white. I won't spoil it too much, but the basic gist is that Ada's been framed for a crime she didn't commit, and has to work to track down and eliminate the true culprit. Her playstyle is a hybrid of Leon and Jake's, with a bit of stealth action thrown in. She's competent with ranged weapons and can defend herself hand to hand, but it's easy to get overwhelmed, so it pays to think tactically and try to slip past while avoiding a fight. I've said before that I've never been a huge fan of Ada's personality, finding her too cold and aloof to feel much empathy towards, but I will say that this campaign takes small steps toward humanising her a little. As I say, Resident Evil 6 takes a unique approach to its storytelling, delivering an experience that feels truly epic and significant. Each of these individual campaigns has its own strengths and weaknesses, but the problem for me is that they don't necessarily gel together into a satisfying whole. Where Capcom sees variety, I see a lack of focus, and I think Resident Evil 6 falls short of its noble goals by trying to be all things to all men. Purists longing for a return to slow-paced survival horror will find Leon's campaign too anemic to hold their interest, while those looking for more action and shooting on par with Resident Evil 4 will find Chris's scenario too dumbed down and Ada's too restrictive. That's not to say this is necessarily a bad game. In fact, there's a lot of positive aspects to it. It's certainly a well-made product from a technical standpoint, featuring top-notch graphics that squeeze just about everything they could out of the PS3, and some of the sequences are truly spectacular, like being caught in the middle of a zombie outbreak in a crowded city. You really feel the sense of panic and impending doom as you fight to escape the disaster zone. Cutscenes and voice acting are both solid, even if some of the dialogue has taken a step backward, and there's a cinematic quality to the direction that demonstrates a good understanding of the action and disaster movies is clearly trying to replicate. As with RE5, there's a heavy emphasis on cooperative gameplay. You can play with a friend locally or online, and while I've made my thoughts on this style of gaming quite clear already, I have to admit it's pretty well implemented, and if you really want to experience Resident Evil with a friend, it can make for a pretty fun experience. There's also an option to randomly match you up with another online player at the same stage of the game, and doing this depends very much on how charitable you feel towards your fellow human beings. More important, it depends on how lucky you happen to be that particular day. Not that I'm saying every player is out to troll you and ruin your game, but the internet isn't exactly known for breeding mutual respect and sportsmanlike conduct. If you're anything like me and you value a gameplay experience that isn't left to the whim of some asshole on the other side of the planet, you'll probably avoid this option in the same way a fat positivity activist avoids salad bars and exercise. AI is generally solid, enemies are aggressive enough to present a threat and make intelligent use of cover and suppressing fire while they try to outmaneuver you, but it rarely feels like you're outmatched. Your companions will get involved in the fight enough to help out and usually manage to stay out of trouble, although occasionally their pathfinding will spaz out and cause problems. You'll be trying to quickly exit a level under heavy fire, only to find your companion stuck on a piece of scenery 50 yards back and overwhelmed before you can get to them. It's frustrating when you feel like you're being penalised for something that's not your fault, but I guess the same criticism applies to most games of this kind. It might not be survival horror any longer, and I think I've flogged that particular horse to death already, so I won't get into it again now. But I'd be lying if I said Resident Evil 6 wasn't fun to play. On the contrary, as I said during my intro, I had far more fun playing this game than I did first time around, perhaps because my expectations had been suitably adjusted. I came in expecting a tedious, repetitive third-person shooter, and instead I was pleasantly surprised to find a competent, well-implemented action-adventure that demonstrates occasional flashes of brilliance and creativity. Playing Resident Evil 6 is more like being forced to eat your favourite dessert morning, noon and night. No matter how much you might initially enjoy it, eventually you're going to get tired of it, and I think that's the big issue here. There's just a bit too much of everything. It's like the developers have never even heard of the concept of restraint. Every aspect of this game is turned up to 11, whether it's the boss fights, the quick time events, the action set pieces, even the cutscenes. It never lets up, and when a game doesn't give you time to breathe, there's no point of reference for the action and it just becomes overwhelming. In conclusion then, Resident Evil 6 represents the apex of the action horror phase of this series. It's the ultimate endpoint of the journey that began with Resident Evil 4 and further developed with Resident Evil 5. Whether you consider that a triumph or a folly very much depends on your own personal perspective and what you want to get out of the series, but for me, I consider this game a bit of a flawed masterpiece, a project of unmatched scope and ambition that didn't quite reach its own lofty goals, but still provided an enjoyable and varied gaming experience. One thing's for sure, however, much as RE4 marked the start of a new era for the series, so Resident Evil 6 would represent the end of that era. Capcom would take a much needed step back from Resident Evil following this game's release, rethinking and re-evaluating the direction they wanted to go next. The result would be one of the most radically different Resident Evil games in more than a decade, but that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching this review. I hope you found it entertaining and informative, and as always, please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. Join me next time where we'll take a look at one of the most significant games in the series, Resident Evil 7.